Okay, so we've been talking about organic versus inorganic compounds, and then we began focusing specifically on organic compounds, and we talked about the basics of how organic compounds are put together, that they are really big and complicated molecules most of the time, and carbon is at the foundation of them, and so on. Then we started focusing specifically on the 4 types of organic compounds, the first of which that we focused on was carbohydrates. Okay, we talked about carbohydrates, how they're really important for energy and things like that. Well, now we're going to focus on the second group of organic compounds, and that is the group called lipids. Okay, so, all right, lipids. There are several different types of lipids. Lipids is a broad category for several different types of compounds: waxes, oils, fats, and steroids. Okay, these molecules all do different things, but they have similar qualities, so we'll try to focus on that. Now, what do they do? Okay, first and foremost, what I want you to think of is that lipids are incredibly important as an energy storage molecule for animals in particular, but plants also use them too to store energy. We talked about carbohydrates being an important energy molecule, but carbs are the main energy storage molecule of plants. It's not that animals can't make a carbohydrate energy storage molecule, but it's not their main one. Lipids are the main energy storage molecule of animals. Okay, they are also good for insulation, keeping you warm. We think blubber. This whale is up in this very northern cold climate, but does just fine because he's got this thick insulating layer of blubber. So think of it as an insulator, keeping animals warm. Okay. Waterproofing is another function of lipids. For example, this goose or a duck floats around in the water all the time, but the water does not penetrate their feathers because they rub this oil from a gland near their tail end. They rub oil all over their feathers such that the water just will kind of bead up on the surface of their feathers rather than penetrating in, and thus they can keep warm and dry whilst at the same time swimming in the water quite a bit. Mammal fur often has the same mechanism. Beavers and things like that will spread oil over their fur, so the outer layer is waterproof and the inner layer is kept dry. Okay. All right. Another function of lipids is to act as a shock absorber. There are fats that are around our organs that kind of help protect them and absorb the shock of getting bumped around and things like that. And perhaps one of the very most important things that lipids do is they are the molecule that is at the foundation of all cell membranes and things like that. We wouldn't have cells if it weren't for lipids. Okay? They also make really important compounds called steroids. Steroids are the foundation for a very important compound you might have heard of called cholesterol. Also the hormones of your body like testosterone or estrogen, things like that, that are very important to us. Cholesterol is actually the foundation of those molecules, and so this is so steroids are just one very important type of lipid that acts as a hormone for us. All right, now you can imagine that since lipids do so many things, there's a lot of variety among their structures. So we're not going to learn the structures of all lipids. I'm going to focus you on the most commonly discussed lipid, and that is a triglyceride. Okay. Lipids, as far as we are concerned, have a fundamental structure of two molecules, two different types of molecules. One is called a glycerol, which is just a type of alcohol, and then 3 fatty acids. Okay? The glycerol really is just a connecting piece. It's a hook, if you will, for the fatty acids to hang on, okay? The 3 fatty acids are the most important part of a lipid molecule. So if you look here, I want to focus you on this bottom half of this picture here, okay? The gray part here, this is the glycerol molecule, and the yellow parts are the 3 fatty acids, okay? So oftentimes when we draw it, I'll just have kids draw a bar and say that's the glycerol, okay? And then there will be 3 tails coming off of it, and those are the fatty acid tails, okay? Now, something else, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but if you look at the fatty acids, they are almost entirely made up of 2 types of atoms, carbons and hydrogens. Almost entirely carbon-hydrogen. That's really important. We'll talk about that some more in a second. In fact, perhaps now. So why are these fatty acids the most important part? Because they are nothing more or less than long chains of carbon and hydrogen. Enormously long chains of carbons and hydrogens. Now, if you'll remember, carbon-hydrogen bonds, the bonds between carbon and hydrogen atoms, are really good at storing energy, okay? They are really good at storing energy. So, fats then, because, look at all this, just carbon-hydrogen, carbon-hydrogen, all over the place, 3 huge rows of just carbon-hydrogen. That is an enormous amount of energy packed in that space. So they are great, great, great energy storage molecules. Now, so just summarizing what we just said, they are really efficient at energy storage. There are so many carbon-hydrogen bonds in a fatty acid that compared to a carbohydrate, remember starch. Yes, there were carbon-hydrogen bonds, but there were also some carbon-oxygen bonds, which does not store energy well at all. So that's kind of a waste of space. There is no wasted space here. Fats produce more energy per gram than carbs do, easily. So you can get way more energy in the same space than you can in a carbohydrate. Okay? Now, some plants do use oils for energy. I'm sure you've heard of corn oil and peanut oil and stuff like that. But because efficiency is really not as important for plants, they're not as active as animals are. Animals are extremely active. They need a lot of energy. Plus, plants don't move around, so they don't have to worry about carrying their energy around with them. So it's just not as important for them to be efficient in their energy storage. So carbohydrates work fine for them. Starch works fine for them, whereas it wouldn't for us. All right, you've probably heard of saturated versus unsaturated fats. Okay, just want to make sure we understand what those mean. A saturated fat is a fat in which each carbon shares a single covalent bond with as many hydrogen atoms as possible. Okay, and so let's imagine this is a fatty acid. I've got a carbon attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon, attached to a carbon. Now, this carbon has got 4 hands to hold, so he could hold hands with a hydrogen, a hydrogen, a hydrogen. This carbon's got 2 hands to hold, so he can hold hands with 2 hydrogens. This has also got 2. So these guys are all holding hands with as many hydrogens as they possibly can, okay? And that results in a very straight, uniform chain, okay? So, when you've got your fatty acids that are saturated, meaning if something is saturated, it's full, it's holding as many hydrogens as possible, what you end up with are very straight fatty acids that look like that. And when you've got straight lines, you can pack them really tightly together, okay? And because they can pack so tightly together when you get a bunch of them, they tend to form solids. And indeed, at room temperature, saturated fats are solid because they pack so tightly together. Okay? Butter and lard are saturated fats, and think of them as being solid at room temperature. So this is basically a diagram of a saturated fat. We've got this really straight carbon hydrogen chain, really straight, really straight, really straight, and they can pack tightly together. Now, an unsaturated fat is a fat in which, okay, here's my carbon, here's my carbon, here's my carbon, here's my carbon, and so they're going to hold hands with their hydrogens, as many as they possibly can. Remember, they only have 4 hands to hold, so they're holding hands with as many as they possibly can. But let's say these 2 carbons here decide they want to ditch their hydrogens, so they're going to get rid of them, and they want to hold hands with each other. Essentially, they're going to create a double bond with each other and ditch their hydrogen buddies. Okay? In this case, these carbons are not holding hands with as many hydrogens as they possibly could, and they're creating this thing called a double covalent bond between them. Well, double covalent bonds are super strong. They're twice as strong as a single covalent bond, perhaps. So what happens is this molecule gets a funky little bend in it right at that point. It bends because of this unusually strong bond. So what happens then is that instead of being straight, the chain gets a crick in it. It bends. And then when you try to put a bunch of these together, they can't pack tightly because some of them are bent up. So they're not bound to the maximum number of hydrogens possible, and that causes the fatty acids to bend. Fatty acids like this cannot pack very tightly together, and because they can't pack tightly, they're not solid, they're more liquidy at room temperature. So in that case, we're talking about things like oils would be unsaturated fats. Okay, so here's just a diagram showing you again a saturated fat, which makes a nice straight chain and it's solid at room temperature, versus this double bond here between these carbons causes this fatty acid to bend, and that makes it be liquid at room temperature, and we get an unsaturated fat. All right, that's it. Done. How painless was that? No, don't answer that question. All right, I will catch you in the next podcast. See you soon.